All right. So, very warm welcome to all of you who have joined the second episode of the New Age Development and Diplomacy series, where we explore opportunities and challenges for subnational diplomacy and development from an Indian foreign policy perspective, but also seeking out global best solutions and practices. And we're very pleased to be able to chat with Mr. Peter Varghese AO, Chancellor of the University of Queensland and former Secretary, Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Mr. Varghese has been in public service for close to 4 decades now, which included senior positions in foreign affairs, trade, and intelligence. His diplomatic postings included as High Commissioner to India from 2009 to 12, High Commissioner to Malaysia, Director General of the Office of National Assessments, and Senior Advisor to the Prime Minister of Australia from 2003 to 4. He was appointed an officer in the Order of Australia in 2010 and received an honorary doctorate of letters from the University of Queensland in 2013. Mr. Varghese, many thanks for coming on the podcast.
Well, thank you, Carl. I'm delighted to join you and looking forward to a good discussion.
Yeah, looking forward to that as well. And we'll be kind of discussing about your thoughts on the India-Australia economic partnership within the framework of this outstanding report that you and your team had come out with, a few years back, the India Economic Strategy 2035 report. And we'll also touch upon some of the levers of economic diplomacy and subnational diplomacy that can be leveraged between both the countries, and also the potential for Australia's higher education institutions in light of India's national education policy that was rolled out earlier last year. And we'll also touch briefly upon your life in government, bureaucracy, and now presently in academia. So that should be a very interesting range of themes.
That's a lot of ground to cover.
That's a lot of ground to cover, but yeah, we'll quickly go through them. So, just to begin our conversation, Mr. Varghese, and this might come across as a cliche, but nevertheless, a very pertinent issue in the diplomatic circles, and that has been how the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted the practice and conduct of diplomacy. Now, it's quite evident that diplomats have faced challenges having to revert to more digital modes of communication with their colleagues and counterparts. But there's really been two schools of thought here. So while we agree that the conduct of diplomacy has been impacted by the coronavirus pandemic, the two schools of thought, in fact, the pessimistic view is that this might call for a scaling back of diplomatic efforts and resources in light of more pressing concerns in the domestic sphere, in domestic economies. And we see this in the case of the Indian Ministry of External Affairs, which has also had to cut back on its budget, this financial year. And the more positive outlook in terms of how diplomacy is going to move forward in the coming years is how countries might look to invest more time, resources, and attention towards global issues that require cooperation. So where would you stand on the spectrum in terms of how diplomacy has been shaped by the pandemic?
Yeah, I think it's a pretty mixed picture, Carl. There's no question that COVID has had a profound impact on the practice of diplomacy. And I think the question really is whether that difference will be long-term and sustained, or whether it's essentially a short-term influence for the duration of the pandemic, however long that may be. And even there, I think, there are pluses and minuses. To my mind, the most adverse consequence of doing diplomacy in a time of COVID is that it's so much harder to deal in the currency of diplomacy, which is essentially relationship building. All diplomacy ultimately depends on a capacity to build relationships, to sustain them, and then to use them for national advantage. And every country's diplomatic service, I think, is in that business. Clearly, relationship building is harder in a virtual world. It's not impossible, but it is harder in a virtual world. And this applies as much to diplomacy as it does to business or to education or to all the other fields that have been impacted by COVID. Now, COVID has given us the concept of a virtual summit. And I think that is, a very kind of practical way to deal with the restrictions that have been put in place on travel and face-to-face meetings. But ultimately, I think there is no escaping the need to build diplomacy on a foundation of strong relationships. And so to that extent, I don't think the COVID changes will be long term. Now, it has had some benefits, I think. I mean, the reality is that it is easier to schedule a multilateral virtual meeting than it is to schedule a physical face-to-face multilateral meeting. So I think for some interactions, technology which has been accelerated by COVID, or at least the use of the technology has been accelerated by COVID, will make it easier to communicate. On your second question, which is whether it will increase or decrease the attention to global issues, I mean, I think that is a much more complicated and in many ways a more sort of interesting question. Because one thing we have seen with COVID is that it has tended to accelerate trends which were there before, rather to itself fundamentally create a new reality. And I think that is particularly evident when it comes to these big issues of globalization and its pace and direction. It seems to me that one of the consequences of COVID is that it has created a psychological space where, if we don't handle it properly, countries and societies and political systems run, in my view, a very high risk of turning inwards. We are already seeing the slowing down of globalization. We are already seeing a rethinking of the whole concept of supply chains. We're already seeing an instinctive return to concepts such as self-reliance and even self-sufficiency. And this has very large consequences if they turn out to be enduring trends as opposed to a passing response to the pandemic. For all of us, I think the nature of the future globalization is going to be fundamental to the way in which we operate as a society, the way in which our economies succeed or don't succeed, or indeed our capacity as an international community to come to grips with the many problems that we face, which are global in dimension and therefore require a global response. So I think there is a risk here that in accelerating the trends for deglobalization, we may be pulled in a direction which ultimately is against our best economic and political interests, both as countries, but also in terms of the international community.
Sure. In terms of Australia's description as a global actor, so it's considered as a middle power in certain quarters, it's considered as a regional power. What is your sense of Australian diplomacy going forward in light of the COVID-19 pandemic? In the past, you have spoken of Australia needing to up the ante in terms of its diplomatic kind of presence. So where do you see the Australian context in all this?
Sure. So Australia is a country which is ultimately reliant on persuasion to pursue its international interests. I mean, we are neither big enough or rich enough to buy or bully our way in the world. And so we are very dependent on our capacity to persuade. And that puts a burden on our diplomacy which we cannot escape and which we must face up to. Now, I obviously, as a former foreign secretary, would like to see a much greater investment by Australia in diplomacy. I mean, if you look at the reach of Australian diplomacy in terms of the number of overseas missions that we have, the resources we devote to diplomacy, the balance between whom we have offshore and whom we have onshore, and you take, say, G20 countries, Australia is towards the bottom of the G20 countries when it comes to that particular measure. Now, precisely because we are also a country which isn't, say, like a European nation, part of a bigger bloc like the EU, or like our Southeast Asian friends, part of ASEAN, the burden we have to carry in making our own way in the world is that much greater. So if you take all of that and pitch it against the fact that our own external environment is now becoming so much more uncertain, so much more complicated, the topography, if you like, of what we have to navigate through is become, again, much more cluttered. All of that suggests to me that we need to be making a much bigger investment in our diplomacy. That's not to say that we should be, decreasing the resources we put into other areas that protect and advance Australia's national interests, including our defence capability. But it's going to be the quality of our external relationships and our ability to work with others, and our imagination, if you like, in putting together new arrangements, new groupings, new coalitions of the willing, if you like, that will ultimately be the test of whether we can succeed in the world or not.
Absolutely, and we'll come to some of those questions around the coalition of the willing towards the end of the podcast. But I just want to maybe touch upon what you had just highlighted in terms of the quality of the external relationships that Australia would like to have in the coming years. And I think this is best captured in the India Economic Strategy report that you had kind of come out with, which provides a very detailed perspective of the different investment potential of India's states. And highly recommend all our listeners to kind of go to that report and maybe read it. It's a very comprehensive report, and we'll definitely link it to the show notes. But what I wanted to ask you, Mr. Varghese, was do you sense any potential challenges in light of the COVID-19 pandemic and even the knock-on effects of the pandemic leading to, as you described, as self-reliant policies of governments, as is in the case in India? So I wanted to understand from you, how is the landscape changed in light of the pandemic? And we also have a question from Natasha, who's the Deputy Director of the Newland Global Group, which is linked to this issue, is if you were given a choice to rewrite the IES 2035 in the post-COVID scenario, what is the one thing you would keep or delete in the document?
Well, it's a great question. Look, I'm not sure COVID in and of itself has shifted the judgments that I made in the India Economic Strategy, but what I think has been highlighted is the fact that the trajectory of the Indian economy, and therefore the capacity of India to play the sort of role in the region and beyond that countries like Australia want it to, is going to turn on its ability to deliver strong and sustained economic growth. And what we are seeing now is that the Indian economy took a big hit during the COVID period. There's nothing particularly remarkable about that. Most of our economies took a big hit prior to COVID. But I think more worryingly, there were signs in India before COVID came along that the economy was slowing rather than expanding, and economic growth rates had dipped to below 5%. Now, in my report, I assumed a level of economic growth for India over the long term, by which I mean over the next 2 to 3 decades, of an average of 6 to 8%. It's going to be important for India's future and for India to deliver the things it wants to deliver for its own people, that it finds a way to return to relatively strong economic growth, with 6 to 8% being at the sort of more conservative end of what strong economic growth in an Indian context is. So that means that the economy is going to be the central axis on which India's international standing will turn. So for India to play a role as a strategic power, it needs to have a very strong economic base. And so I think the challenge for India is how do you find in a large and argumentative democracy sufficient consensus to pursue an economic reform agenda which would provide a sustainable foundation for India to grow at the levels of 6, 7, 8, 9% a year for decades that it really needs. And I think that's an open question at the moment as to whether the Indian political system is up to that. I mean, India has its own political culture. It's a country which has gone through many periods of very high state intervention in the economy. It has this quite remarkable contrast between a political culture which is instinctively in favor of state intervention to address most challenges, and an entrepreneurial tradition which is, of course, anchored in the marketplace. And it is finding that sort of happy medium between political culture and an entrepreneurial spirit, which I think has always been the big challenge of Indian economic policy. I mean, it's not that the list of reforms is unknown or difficult to compile. I mean, this has been the subject of economic debate in India now for many, many decades. I mean, reform in areas like labor market regulation, land acquisition, the regulatory system, the need to ensure that India's ease of doing business improves, the attractiveness of India as a foreign investment destination, the extent to which in the trade of goods, India should be pursuing a more ambitious policy of trade liberalization, reduction of trade tariffs, entering into trade agreements such as RCEP and so on. I mean, these are all debates within the Indian system, and where India comes out on those and how they all fit together, I think, is going to be the big question. So I wouldn't necessarily kind of add or delete anything fundamental in the India economic strategy. It's still my view that the structural drivers of the Indian economy, namely the urbanization of the world's largest agricultural population, the movement from an informal to a formal economy, a young demographic, which if properly utilized can be a key economic asset, now significant investment in infrastructure, that all of these factors remain drivers of the Indian economy. But I guess the point of caution that I would add is that those structural drivers in and of themselves are not sufficient to deliver the high rates of growth that India needs. And that's where economic reform and political leadership and the political culture to which I referred become very, very important. So those of us who want to see India succeed want to see India find a way forward on the path of economic reform, which in any country is very difficult. But making sure that political capital is therefore invested with that objective in mind, I think is going to be very important for the future of India.
No, I think that's a very interesting observation. And also, I think this ties well with Australian efforts to kind of collaborate with Indian stakeholders here. And I think the role of the mission, the diplomatic missions, the consulates, as they call it, is quite important here, because I think Australia has 4 consulates in India: New Delhi, Mumbai, Chennai, and Kolkata. The last one being the most recent consulate that was formed. So what I wanted to understand from you was, given that Australia is looking towards India as a major strategic and investment potential space, and there are a few countries, only a handful of countries in the non-Western world, the others being Indonesia and Japan, with whom Australia has 4 other consulates. So I wanted to understand from you, how has the role of the consulate evolved over the years since the time you were the High Commissioner to India? And what is the specific role of the consulate in terms of executing the ideas of the report and the recommendations in the report?
Yeah, so I put a bit of emphasis on increasing our consular footprint in India in my report, and I recommended that we, as a matter of urgency, set up a consulate in Calcutta, and that we look in the not too distant future to set up also a consulate in Bangalore. The government has accepted those recommendations. It's delivered on a Calcutta consulate, and I hope at some point we'll be able to open up in Bengaluru as well. Now, the reason I did put that emphasis on consulates is that my report puts quite a bit of weight on a state-based economic strategy, because I think it's best to think about India as a collection of states and state economies and regional economies, rather than a single unified Indian national economy. And so if you're going to pursue a state-based strategy, and I recommended a focus on 10 states, you need to have the diplomatic platform and the diplomatic footprint and the diplomatic resources to be able to deal with that state-based strategy, the differences between states, the sort of differences in nuance, and so on. So I see the consulates as really an extension of Australia's High Commission presence in Delhi. Each of the consulates have assigned to them a list of Indian states, which they are responsible for in terms of delivering consular services, but they're also responsible for in terms of building our trade and investment relationship. And so, the consulates general have a very important role in promoting trade and investment. They have an important role in building up links and relationship with state governments. They have an important role in keeping the Australian government informed of what's happening on the ground in the states and what opportunities that might open up. Because I think what we'll see into the future is a higher level of international activity, and we can return to this concept later, by both Australian states and by Indian states. And so for all of those reasons, I think it makes sense to do more at the consular level. And I think, we're now seeing in India this competitive federalism dynamic, by which I mean state governments who are trying to position themselves in such a way that they are seen both by the domestic market and by international investors as the place to go to set up business and to invest. And I think on the whole, that's a very healthy dynamic for India to have that kind of, competition to attract business and investment, because what it means is that state governments more and more will focus on the barriers to effective business investment and the barriers to setting up businesses in their states. And the more that is addressed, obviously, the more open the market in India will be, and the easier it will become to set up businesses in India, both for a domestic market and for an export market.
Right. So another dimension, Mr. Varghese, is that of the sister city and sister state relationships that had kind of started. The whole trend of having sister cities had started a few decades ago, probably when you were still the High Commissioner to India. There's also this evolving concept of the smart cities, which has taken shape in the Indian context, but also in Australia. And if I can cite an example, in Queensland itself, there is an ambitious scheme to install a 550-kilometer undersea fiber optic cable that would allow Queensland businesses to bypass Sydney and connect directly with Asia. So you see initiatives being taken at the subnational level. And in the report also, you had very rightly pointed out that in the Indian context, municipal governments, right, the local governments are as important as the state governments in many respects. So my question to you then would be, how can India and Australia leverage their para-diplomacy relationship going forward? And Australia has competitive advantage, which you again bring out in the report in terms of transport systems, in agriculture, etc. So how do you think this part of the relationship can be furthered in the coming years?
Yeah, so I think the subnational level is going to play quite an important role in the overall strategy for building up the Australia-India relationship. And I mean, what we've seen in Australia over the period of COVID is, if you like, a resurgence in the profile and the authority of Australian state governments, because they have control over state borders and they have control over health systems. So at a time of a pandemic, they have exercised a degree of autonomy which we haven't seen in our national politics for a very long time. While local governments are of a different dimension, they too are interested in playing a bigger role on the international stage. And you do have groupings such as the Asia Pacific Cities groupings, which bring together mayors and others from across the region. So I think, sister states, sister city relationships, I mean, they tend to be primarily of symbolic value. They are a gesture, if you like, to indicate an interest in building a relationship. But they're also, I think, a signal that cities in Australia and states in Australia want a broader and deeper relationship with cities and states in India. And I think, you know, that's something which will probably grow in significance. I mean, if you compare the job of a High Commissioner of Australia to India today with what that person would have been doing, say, in the 1950s or the 1960s, I think one of the very big differences would be the amount of time and effort that a High Commissioner in Delhi would be putting into the relationship by Australian states in India and the visit by state trade delegations and state premiers. I mean, this would not have featured at all in Australian diplomacy, you know, several decades back. And if you look at you know, the framework of sectors and states that form the sort of core of my India economic strategy, the state governments have been kind of doing that in any event, working state to state, but also taking advantage of their comparative advantage. So if you look at the trade profile, and to a lesser extent the investment profile of each of the Australian states in India, they really reflect where those states have comparative advantage. So a stronger focus on the resources side in states like Queensland and Western Australia, more emphasis on the services sector in states like New South Wales and Victoria. And the smart cities concept and the room that it opens up for more collaborative work between Australia and India sort of bring a lot of those threads together, because you know, successful cities tend to contribute to successful states and to successful nations. And because so much of our life these days, particularly in a country like Australia, which is, to the surprise of many outsiders, one of the most urbanized countries in the world. I mean, people normally think of Australia as a country of wide open spaces and small population, but if you look at our urbanization rates, you know, they are exceptionally high. So our urban experience, which obviously reflects our own history and our own geography and the structure of our economy, nevertheless does open up the basis for a dialogue with India as it pursues a smart city strategy. So, you know, what goes into a smart city? Where does infrastructure sit? Where does creative industry sit? How do you get a critical mass of innovation in a city culture? Because cities tend to be more incubators of creativity than perhaps rural areas. You know, how do you deal with basic but nevertheless crucial issues like water management? How do you handle transport? And the interesting thing is that even though our scale is so different, and you could well say, well, you know, what can Australia contribute to this discussion in an Indian context, given the difference in our population size? The design of systems is actually applicable almost irrespective of scale. And in any event, you know, cities like Sydney and Melbourne, I mean, they're not small cities even by global standards. So I think, you know, even there we can have a very productive dialogue and learn from each other.
Again, I think that's a very interesting observation that you put out there, which actually brings me to a potential downside, which was even noted in the Australian foreign policy space, and that was to do with the Australian federal government's proposal to veto, you know, international city agreements, you know, agreements of territories, of states, of universities, foreign universities even, and that's not been, you know, kind of celebrated in some circles. And I think the context to that is also important to add here. The Victorian government's MOU with China on one of the BRI projects. I think that was really what set off this conversation. So what I wanted to ask you was, is this downside relevant in the 21st century? And do you see this evolving into something more contentious between the federal and states? And as you pointed out, in the COVID pandemic and even in the Indian context, it's the states that have really taken the lead in that respect. So yeah, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, it is something which could become, I think, more controversial and a larger bone of contention between the states and the federal government, but also between universities and the federal government. So, look, I think the issue here is this: the government, through legislation at the centre, has given itself pretty wide-ranging powers to veto arrangements entered into by state governments and by universities. And the question is whether they will misuse what is a wide-ranging power. Now, so far, I think there's only three agreements that have been cancelled, if you like, by the federal government, and one of them relates to a memorandum of understanding that the Victorian state government concluded in relation to the Belt and Road Initiative. I think what's important here is to understand where authority and jurisdiction begins and ends. So under our constitution, the foreign affairs power is squarely in the hands of the federal government, the central government, and therefore I think it's quite legitimate for the federal government to say that it has exclusive jurisdiction over foreign policy, and therefore if state governments were to act contrary to Australian foreign policy, that would create a potential problem. I don't think from a constitutional point of view that's a particularly controversial statement to make. When it comes to universities, I think it's a little bit more complicated because ultimately there is no obligation on a university to act in ways which are always consistent with Australian foreign policy, because Australian foreign policy is a very broad concept, and in many ways it will go through periods where it is very subjective. So I think universities are comfortable with the proposition that when it comes to something narrower like national security, it is reasonable for the federal government to have an expectation that Australian universities would not act in a way which runs counter to Australia's national security. And I don't think universities, the leadership of universities, would be troubled by that proposition, because they too are interested in ensuring that Australia's national security is not harmed. But I think the concept of having to pass a test of whether something is consistent with Australian foreign policy for universities is much more problematic, and really goes to questions of the autonomy of the institution and the nature of academic freedom. So we're going to have to wait and see how all of this pans out. I mean, each university has been required to submit to the federal government a list of agreements that they've entered into with so-called non-autonomous institutions, namely institutions that are ultimately controlled by a foreign government or a political party. And that's a very large number of agreements. I mean, in our case at the University of Queensland, I think it's probably around 600 to 700 agreements fall into that category. We've got 39 universities in Australia, so you can do the maths. It's going to be, not all of them would have the same number as we would, but nevertheless, the total number would be rather large. So, I think we're all waiting to see just what, if any, action the federal government takes in relation to any of those agreements, and whether it seeks to cancel any of them, and if so, the grounds on which it seeks to cancel them. So That's why I say this could become more contentious than it currently is.
Right. I think this is fitting segue into maybe the Indian government's new national education policy, which I'm sure you're well aware, and where Australian universities can even take the lead, given that even in your report, education or higher education was indicated as the flagship sector, right, between
Yes.
both the countries. What I wanted to ask you was, are there already potential areas of collaboration with Indian universities that, say, for instance, University of Queensland have in mind? And how would you leverage this particular policy going forward? Since you
Yeah.
also spoke about the larger, agendas that needs to be taken care of at the Indian level.
Yeah. So, look, I think the National Education Policy is an impressive document. Um, how much of it will be and can be implemented, I think, still remains an open question. I mean, the setting up of foreign campuses in India has been on the national agenda now for a very long time, but has struggled to get through Parliament and to navigate its way through the various interest groups at play in the Indian education sector. But that said, I think the broad thrust of the NEP is very consistent with the argument I sought to put in my report, which was that, as you say, education can be the flagship sector for the building of the Australia-India relationship. And I've always seen that as really falling into three categories. One is for us to move up the quality curve in terms of how we're perceived in India as a provider of university education. In other words, for aspiring Indian students to see Australia as a world-class education destination, because there's no question that in the past and probably still Indian students who want to go abroad in search of a quality education see the US and the UK as their sort of first ports of call rather than Australia. And I think we've got very good universities. We have 6 in the top 100. We're very competitive. So moving up that quality curve, I think, is very important. Secondly, I think Australia can play a very important role in partnering with India on vocational education, because vocational education is going to be a very large component of India's upskilling ambitions, and we need to find a way for Australia to be a useful partner. And to do that, we need to turn the Australian business model on its head, because what Australia has is very low volume, high cost quality vocational education, and India needs the opposite. It needs high volume, low cost vocational education. So let's see whether we can adjust our business models to take advantage of that. And the last area I've identified is, if you accept the fact that upskilling 400 million people in India will be ultimately delivered off the back of IT platforms rather than through bricks and mortar, then I think Australia can work with India on content, on curriculum content, not on platforms, which India doesn't need any advice on, but working together on content. Now, on the quality curve, to me that means deepening our research collaboration with India, and in particular doing more on the postgraduate level. And so my own university, University of Queensland, has set up a joint research academy with Delhi IIT, one of your leading higher education institutions. And under this research academy, we will deliver joint PhDs badged by UQ and Delhi IIT to around 250 to 300 at its peak PhD graduates. And the interesting thing about that, Carl, is that the research topics that will be identified, all of them flow from national priorities in India and Australia. So this is a slightly different approach to how you choose your doctoral research topics. So rather than a bottom-up process where an individual student comes up and says, you know, I've had a great passion to do a PhD in this area, we're starting from a different perspective, which is to say these are the sort of big national issues for India and also for Australia, and we want to see research doctoral topics that, you know, address those large challenges. So ours is just one example. I think we'll see more of those examples, and ours wasn't the first, but, you know, I hope very much that we will see this deepening of our research collaboration. We already have a very effective Australia-India Science Research Fund that's doing similar sorts of things. We need to deepen that. I recommended we increase the funding in it. I think the government's very, on both sides, is very open to doing that. So, you know, I see a strong future for us at the quality end of university education and research.
Oh, wonderful. I think most of our listeners would also agree that the India-Australia relationship has the bedrock of it, rather, has always been the people-to-people ties, and the higher education segment in particular has kind of contributed towards this. So that's quite fascinating. And I actually want to come to a final, round of questions since you're a very busy person. So I'll not kind of take too much of your time. So, when you look back on your career, you've had a very multi-varied background, serving in bureaucracy, in the intelligence, and now in academia. So what would you recommend each of these domains could learn from each other? Maybe, bureaucracy and academia, and what's been your takeaways from these domains?
Well, I don't think they have enough to do with each other, and we should be looking for opportunities to bring them much closer together, because I think each could benefit from a closer relationship with the other. You know, at the end of the day, one of the most valuable things that you can reach for is diversity of thinking, because diversity of thinking tends to lead to better analysis and better solutions to the challenges that you face. I think in government we can sometimes be a bit narrow in our thinking, and because we're so preoccupied with the urgent, we tend not to have much time to engage with and listen to a much broader spectrum of analysis, the sort of analysis that you would get in academia. I think bringing academia and government closer together also has the value of helping people in government find the flaws in government policy. See, I've always had this view that the best way of challenging policy is to falsify it. In other words, to find out where its flaws are. And the more rigorous you are in trying to identify and falsify policy, the more confidence you can have that your policy settings are going to work. And so I think academia can play a very important role in helping us to do that. And in the reverse direction, I think there's no doubt that academia can sometimes see the work of government and the construction of public policy in far too theoretical and abstract a way. And so understanding the sort of practical challenges that governments face, recognizing what is useful and what is less useful, explaining things in ways that, busy policymakers who don't have the time to read through, hundreds of pages of, turgid analysis, how you communicate. I mean, those are things that I think academia would learn well from government, and we're all looking for ways to make sure that our institutions are fit for purpose. Universities are under a lot of pressure to ensure that its relationship with business is strong, that it can commercialize research. So the more we can talk to each other, the more we have a better line of sight about what drives the other and what makes things work and what makes things not work. I think the better.
Right. I completely agree with you. And I think this is an ongoing debate even in the Indian context. But I'm sure it's certainly more matured in the Australian landscape, given that there's more cross functioning between these different domains. And there are like early signs that we might see this shaping up in India as well. So my final question then to you, Mr. Varghese, would be on the Quad. And I'm sure a lot of our listeners are eagerly waiting to hear your strategic kind of views on how the Quad is going to shape up in the coming years. And you have also talked about how its collective kind of resources might prove to be a challenge for China. And it's important to bring that strategic equilibrium in your words, or I think I'm paraphrasing when I say that. So what would you think are some of the more urgent areas of collaboration among the Quad countries? You talked about the supply chain. So is that something which is prominent in your perspective?
Yes. So look, I think the Quad is one element in a broader strategy for creating a new strategic equilibrium in the Indo-Pacific that can cope with a very different China. And so as we try and come to grips with a China which looks more and more interested in recreating the world of the Middle Kingdom, where harmony was hierarchy and China was at the top of the hierarchy, and other states preemptively conceded China's interests were paramount. What can we do to ensure a measure of stability in this new strategic environment? And so my view is that the relationship with China needs to be framed around two concepts: engage and constrain. So engaging China is obvious, why you would want to engage the world's largest or second largest economy, depending on what time frame you're thinking about, and a country which has not just economic but also geopolitical clout. We need to be able to engage rather than shun or boycott China. But equally, I think the days of hope for the best engagement are now gone, and we need to find a way to have some capacity to push back when China behaves in a way which is unacceptable, whether it's coercive behavior or whether it is using economic power for coercive strategic benefit, if you like. Now, I think the only way you can logically construct a framework which has a chance of succeeding in pushing back in those circumstances is through some collective action. Well, clearly a country like Australia is not by itself going to have the ability to do that. And the Quad, in my mind, represents the core of such a group, because each of those four members of the Quad, for their own reasons, which are not identical by any means, don't want to live in a recreated Middle Kingdom and are uncomfortable with the concept of an unrestrained Chinese paramountcy in the Indo-Pacific region. So I think the Quad over time needs to develop strategies which would make their capacity to push back credible. Now, that's not a call for a Quad military alliance, because I don't think that's the way this is going to work. But it could well mean joint action to signal to China when a red line is crossed. And that joint action could be diplomatic in its form, in the sense of joint diplomatic efforts. It could be, in some circumstances, pushing back in the economic realm. And it could be, in some circumstances, even pushing back in the strategic realm. I'm thinking here particularly of when issues like freedom of navigation may be compromised or blocked. So these are very, very early days. And so I don't think it's easy to sort of sketch out in detail what a coming together of the Quad will actually translate into. But I must say it has moved faster as a concept than I would have thought. And in large measure, it's moved faster as a concept because China's own behavior seems to have shifted more quickly than most people anticipated. So the Quad will be one, but by no means the only component in this broader challenge, which in my view will take a generation or more to construct this new strategic equilibrium in the Indo-Pacific.
Quite fascinating, and I think I've done my duty. I've been able to cover a whole range of themes.
A lot of ground, yes.
A lot of ground. Maybe just one final, maybe your closing thoughts on cricket, which has been a very, kind of the synergies between both countries, I think, are fair, there to see. So maybe a tongue-in-cheek kind of question, but what were your emotions going through during the GABA test that India recently won earlier this year?
Yeah. So look, I've learned that the best way of creating a controversy is for Australians to make comments on India-Australia test matches. But having said that, and I live in Brisbane, so I was at I did attend the GABA test match. I mean, it was brilliant cricket. I mean, there was no question it was brilliant cricket. And I don't think anyone begrudged that victory to India because they played exceptionally well. India happens to have, I think, at the moment, a very good team. Where you sit in the cricket hierarchy tends to shift over time. And Australia has a lot of depth in its cricket, and I'm sure we will sort of give India a run for its money. But look, cricket is one of those things that both unite and divide Australia and India. I mean, it is a common interest, a common language. You very easily get into conversations of cricket, but it is also, it's got a competitive edge to it, and so that keeps us on our toes.
Absolutely, and thanks for that very sporting response. And and we also hope to see more engagements with different stakeholders in Australia. So we spoke about the subnational actors. The Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade has become a very important actor. So all in all, I think this was one conversation that will live long in my memory. And thank you so much, Mr. Varghese. This was wonderful speaking to you, an absolute honor, I must also add. So thanks so much for joining the Bridge Project podcast.
Well, thank you, Carl. It was my pleasure, and I very much enjoyed our conversation. And I wish you and your viewers all the best.
Thanks.